Hello, everyone. It's a real pleasure and honor for me to be here. I'm very grateful to be invited to give this talk because it's been an occasion for me to study a filmmaker I've long admired, and in fact, a Hong Kong tradition I've long admired. I want to pay tribute to a very fine filmmaker as well as the contributions that he made to a distinctive trend or tradition in world cinema. I believe that Hong Kong cinema has made unique contributions to the art of film around the world, and this is a good point of entry for me. But what I'd like to do is start by talking about what those traditions are and what sorts of contributions I think Mr. Lau has made. When we study film history, we often pick out national schools, national trends. So one example would be Hollywood cinema, which gets really started in the 1910s, and it develops a certain aesthetic, a certain way of making films, such as reliance on cut-in shots, development of so-called continuity, which other filmmaking traditions have picked up on. Other national schools would include German Expressionism with the cabinet of Dr. Caligari, Soviet montage, the 1920s, such as the Battleship Potemkin, Italian neorealism in the 1940s and 50s, as seen in something like Umberto D. All of these and many others have had some influence beyond their local time and place. Well, these are pretty well-established categories. Most historians recognize these as distinctive schools. But what I think is less frequently recognized is that there's an Asian action tradition as well. The martial arts cinemas of Asia form another stylistic tradition that we can study as making contributions to international filmmaking. I would mention Japan from the 1920s onward, and particularly Hong Kong and Taiwan from the 1960s onward. These are really, to me, as creative and interesting artistically as other national schools. To go specifically to the Chinese martial arts cinema, for a long time, the silent era, from the silent era onward, there have been wuxia pian, many of them fantasy exercises, and there have been Cantonese martial arts films since at least the 1940s, and films you're familiar with in the Wong Fei Hung series, for instance. What makes Chinese martial arts, I think, particularly grateful to cinema is that it has some outward cinematic features, some things that are intrinsically interesting for the camera. So, for instance, for both the martial arts and the various theatrical traditions of China, you have on the one hand a performance discipline. It's very strict, very rigorous, and a dependence on patterned movement, on creating patternings within the ways the physical body is being used. And this yields a choreography that is really well suited to being captured on film. Similarly, that discipline and that movement have strongly rhythmic qualities. They have a pulse. They're kind of staccato. They have a pause, burst, pause patterning to them. So you have a frozen moment, a burst of action, and another frozen moment. And that sort of sets off each passage of movement. It's as if putting it in parentheses or bracketing it. And that's very agreeable for cinema because cinema can not only display those dynamic features, it can enhance them through camera position, through camera movement, through cutting and other features of the medium. So there's a kind of nice marriage between Chinese traditions of martial arts and theatrical performance and the possibilities of cinema. And I think those come into particularly rich blending in Chinese martial arts film. And the one trend within that tradition I want to focus on is the one that develops in the Shaw Studios from 1965 to around 1984. You can date it a little later if you want, to 86, I guess. But what was happening there, I think, was something quite distinctive and unusual in world cinema. A very striking local style that became powerful internationally. The movies that came out of that tradition really don't look like any other movies we'd ever seen before. That's traceable to the establishment of that facility in 57 and 58, thanks to Run Run Shaw and Run Me Shaw. They created that enormous facility known as Movie Town and set it up there on Clearwater Bay with a vast array of sets, including a lake and standing sets of streets and shops. The photos I'll be showing you in color are from my visit from 1997. I don't know if those sets are still standing, but they were being used in television when I was visiting. Behind the scenes, I found set storage, big, long buildings that had lots of different kinds of sets there. And I also found a shed full of trampolines and mattresses. Why trampolines? Well, as you know, it was important to have things that could launch people into space, because in 1965, the Shaw's action era begins with films that really do try to present that tradition of wuxia storytelling on the screen in a new way. And so films like Temple of the Red Lotus and Twin Swords become early examples of efforts to modernize the martial arts film of China. They have many sources, those films, indigenous ones, of course, that to opera and theater, both Northern and Southern, and various versions of it, and the new martial arts novels, as they were called, of Jin Yong and Louis Cha. There were foreign influences as well, the Japanese jidaigeki, or swordplay films of Kurosawa, which were screened for Shaw Brothers directors, and also the Zatoichi films of the Blind Swordsman. And those films were actually distributed by the Shaws. Also the influence of Italian Westerns. There's also new technology involved. Color and widescreen became more common. Shaws self-consciously upgraded their production to color features, particularly for costume pictures and historical dramas, and especially the use of a widescreen process, Shawscope, adapted from various borrowed systems. The first widescreen film was a musical, actually, Les Belles, 1961. So gradually the Shaws were modernizing the technology that they were working with that would be there to apply to these new wuxia films later in the decade. The breakthroughs were, among the breakthroughs, I should say, were Temple of the Red Lotus, 1965, and King Hu's very fine film, Come Drink With Me, of 1966. These proved so popular that the company was able to go on and develop the genre. And major directors like King Hu and Chang Che produced many films of consequence there. Come Drink With Me, of course, also Magnificent Trio. Soon, King Hu would leave, but Chang Che and others began to develop this in extensive directions. So I'd like to just mention some narrative conventions of the Shaw's wuxia films. There are others, but these seem to me salient. The conflict that's externalized through combats, obviously these are action pictures, so we expect fights. There's the premise of the rivalry of martial arts traditions between North and South, competing schools, or Chinese, Japanese, Korean, as in the case of Heroes of the East, where different national martial arts traditions are coming into conflict. There's a hierarchy of villains, where villains our hero has to encounter several of them as he climbs his way up this sort of echelon of figures. The plots tend to be somewhat episodic by a lot of standards. They're not as tightly woven as we might find in other kinds of filmmaking traditions, but that sets off the possibility of set pieces, sort of commonplace, expected and conventional sorts of scenes like fights, training sequences, secret techniques, and so on. And then usually the final reel will have a very extensive fight. Two major stylists I'll just mention, though I'm sure you're familiar with them. One is Chang Che, whose work is characterized by plots driven by revenge, by the idea of what he called staunch masculinity, heroic virtue in a male figure, a formal patterning that involves sort of tit for tat, that kind of wounding, emphatic violence, certainly, very strong violence, partly influenced, I think, by the Japanese cinema of the period. Martial arts becoming a test of loyalty and deep friendship. And because he makes so many films and works with so many collaborators, it's fair to say, I think, that Chang Che's films really helped establish the Shaw signature style with particular choreographers and screenwriters. The other, who I mentioned already, King Hu, is rather different. I mean, he's interested in historical and political intrigue. He's interested in both male and female warriors. He's interested in certain kinds of formal patterns like spatial concentration. So he makes a series of films set in inns. The violence in his films is somewhat more stylized than we find in the Chang-che films. He takes martial arts as a display of not just force and power, but grace, and I would argue cinematic virtuosity. He really tries to use the martial arts as an occasion for exploring unusual film techniques. Now, he does leave Shaw's fairly early, as I mentioned here, to create other works, very original ones, I think, in Taiwan. But he has a powerful influence. Then again, there's Kar-leung. As a martial arts director, he, from at least the 60s to 2005, he's very prolific. And as a credited director, he makes over 25 films from 1975 to 2003. So he's a really very formative figure. Here I show you him as a young man with Chang-che. And in what follows, I'll be signaling a film that he did not sign as director, but is credited for coordinating the martial arts for. He, too, is a distinctive filmmaker, I think. If we were to do an in-depth study of him as an auteur, we would talk about the uniqueness of the martial arts traditions that he wants to celebrate. He often builds his film around one or two particular schools of martial arts. He likes to mix comedy with drama in a way that's really pretty alien to Chang-che, by and large. He likes to have credit sequences that preview the techniques that are going to come, and even some of the conflicts in the narrative to come, so the kind of abstract prologues. He likes to present, and we'll see this a lot in what I show you, variations of combat strategies, including parodies that often you'll find within a film, a sequence of serious combat. Later in the film, that the terms of that combat are parodied or mocked in comic ways. And instead of an emphasis on revenge, he puts an emphasis on redemption and forgiveness. But above all, what I want to talk about today and focus is the new uses he makes of the Hong Kong wuxia style that developed at Shaw Brothers. That style consolidates, I think, in 1967 to early 1970s period. It's then when most of the premises of that style are laid out, and I would like to mention some of those now. As I say, no movies before it ever looked quite like these because they're really very distinctive. And the wuxia techniques that are developed in those films got transferred to the kung fu genre, which emerged very quickly after the swordplay films I'm mentioning, such as Chinese Boxer and Chinese Connection. So what are some of the conventions? Well, high production values, big sets, complicated sets with lots of figures, lots of apertures, lots of design, and what I call handmade special effects. This is where the trampolines come in, where you can use pretty low budget processes to create very astonishing martial arts feats. There's also a very flagrant color design, flamboyant color design, such as very early, 1965, early in the cycle. You already see it in Twin Swords, where the pastels of the women behind are set off by the more vibrant colors of the figures in the foreground. And Twin Swords, again, later is a beautiful shot where a sort of butterscotch colored outfit of the woman in the center is set off against the grays and browns, earth tones around her. It gets quite elaborate later on, particularly in Chang-che's later films of the 70s, but even there he can be somewhat subdued, as in Crippled Avengers, where again earth tones predominate on the palette, but a white burst of white and skin tones flash out at you as set off from those. And indeed here in the climax of Crippled Avengers, where the various characters combine to defeat the villain, they're wearing differently colored outfits, not flagrantly so, but still striking. The Shaw style also plays on the power of editing, and I'll be having a lot to say about that in the time that remains. But King Hu's Come Drink With Me sets the pattern for this, I think, with very rapid cutting. He, again, I said, used some of these scenes of action to experiment with different editing patterns. And here, these frames are from a 35 millimeter print, so you can see how short they are, how brief the cutting is. 30 frames, 10 frames, 10, 10, all rhythmically matching each other. That's that percussive quality I was talking about. And then a shot where all the figures running into each other come together. But that, again, is only half a second. So what about Lau in relationship to that group style of the studio? Well, I think he contributed to it because he was staging martial arts scenes for Chang Cheh and other directors. He also innovated in it. And I want to look at some of those innovations in terms of camera placement and composition, how you fill the frame, cutting, analytical editing and its possibilities, cutting in terms of constructive editing and a precisionist approach I'll be talking about, and then the smash zoom, which is not just the kind of gimmick it's often taken to be. And then I'll end by talking about his enduring influence. First, composition. The Shaw's style, because it was using anamorphic widescreen, did emphasize the long shots that could be filled up with ingratiating material, things that would be striking for you. So really filling the frame became part of the Shaw's look. And indeed, you can see it in both the extreme long shot and the heroic ones. Here, Trail of the Broken Blade is interesting because the master shot is decentered. You don't expect to see that group of men off-center to the degree that they are. But again, I think it's part of the Shaw style to really quite self-consciously fill that wide anamorphic frame. Here, by adding a little purple accent of the man who comes in on the far left and makes his way in among the others. So there's quite a self-conscious approach for Shaw's directors in general to filling the screen. Another example of this would be New One-Armed Swordsman, Chang Cheh film with the choreography by Kar-leung. The first shot is 43 seconds, a rather long kind of shot for a Shaw Brothers film, but it's a very clever use of that widescreen frame. We start with some survivors of a skirmish among swordsmen and lifting away the bodies of their fallen comrades. And as they do so, they clear a space so we can see in the distance there are more dead swordsmen, and one who is dead, but he's dead on his feet. He's got that gray figure in the center of the frame standing poised, but he's not alive. And more men come in and take away the dead that are in the center of the frame, but that man who's frozen there dead, upright, remains. And only after all that area has been cleared away does our protagonist enter, the guy who's going to become the new one-armed swordsman in the course of the film. And that little slice of space back there has been saved for him. A very shrewd, slowly revealing space that we get here by filling up various zones of the action, in this case, a little aperture in the background. Well, what do you do with closer views? Chang Cheh was quite interested in what he called the warm low camera angle. He believed that the low camera angle was a dynamic thing to use, and it produced a greater emotional intensity. And so a film like The Assassin has a great number of these low angle shots. But my point is that even when the characters are quite close to the camera, the Shaw style tends to favor filling up the screen and not having a lot of empty space on either side. The whole area is really used. Same thing with Chinese Boxer, which in the course of the shot, the Wang Yu character is surrounded by these men. The camera arcs around him, and then the men's fists and shoulders come in so that the empty space around him gets filled up by their bodies. And we understand he's really surrounded. It's an effective way to indicate how vulnerable he is. Now, what I want to do is show the first Lau Kar-leung extract from Dirty Ho. So we can look at that now.
谢谢范老师在最先坊请我喝名贵陈酒。
别客气，听说王老爷是一位长酒专家，难得你由京城来到广东，又肯赏脸试一下我们水酒，真是难得。
哪里？
来，我们再干一杯。
好，
斟酒
是。
大爷，
徒弟， 真没有规矩！快点儿过来站在师傅的身边。
你真以为我把你当我师傅？我只不过是为了这个。哎呦，
这样就够了。快过来拜见范老师。
哎，不用客气，就让你徒弟坐在那边听听曲子。王老爷，我们再干一杯。
好啊，干杯！
干！
哼！啊，真纯呐！
王老爷，这些水酒算得了什么？小陆
在。
我们是不是预备了一些特别的酒？
是啊，有9种百年好酒。
第一种是什么？
归路二仙酒
啊，这酒的名字那么奇怪。
王老爷，要不要品尝一下？
好啊，
请。
好啊，
请。
请坐，
请。
酒来了。
真特别呀！
请。
啊，是这样喝的吧？
不是这样，应该是这样的。
自己喝太没意思，还是我来先敬你。
不用客气。小陆，拿酒来。
是。
王老爷，请。王老爷，这归路二仙酒味道怎么样？
味醇带香，是好酒。
再来一杯。
是。
范老师，这是第一种。第二种呢？
五龙二虎酒。
龙虎并合，一定很强啊！
不错。请。
请。酒味很香啊，
多蒙欣赏。
其味无穷啊！
请再喝。
龙腾、虎踞，这种酒不像是广东酿出来的。
王老爷对酒的认识真不少，我们这里还有很多美酒，王老爷请过去试试。
范老师，这种酒又叫什么呢？
What we find here is a very ingenious set of strategies, I think, for filming that widescreen shot. First, long shots, which Lau does by giving us master shots of the entire action from different angles. It's important that he establishes the different stations where the action is going to take place in those different chairs, the side-by-side chairs that the characters are going to inhabit. First, the two in the background, the prince and Mr. Fan, and then the prince and Mr. Fan take one on the left, take a seat on the left, and then on the right. And even there you might say, well, he hasn't really filled up the space because there's that gap on the left after they've sat down, but immediately a servant comes in to fill it up. So this is not as off-center as it might seem. It comes rebalanced. When you have a full shot, there are various ways to balance it, and it can be done through more or less bilateral symmetry. Two characters are mirror images of each other. You can have a triangular composition, which he has here, 3 characters' faces. And you can have a kind of joke on symmetry where the 2 characters are facing the same way, very similar positions, each half of the frame. And when Mr. Fan tries to swap his fan at the prince puts it away, blocks it, and then you have the idea of the symmetry, even more comic, because they take the drinks at the same time in unison. You can fill the close frame in terms of the closer views. And this is something that's quite ingenious and something that Lau likes to do. When he moves in close, he still finds parts of other people's bodies or pieces of props or bits of setting he can put in the shot to kind of not make it seem like there's just a head floating in a vacant area. So here with Mr. Fan, and here with Ho himself, got the props on the table to kind of offset his off-centered look. And of course the Prince looks, and we rack focus to the wine being poured in the foreground. Here again, the whole frame is being used with a kind of a reverse angle on the two men. And the same thing here, the camera pans over from that framing to another more or less symmetrical framing, pans left with Mr. Fan and his servant. So even though the camera is close, and a lot of directors would simply have the head there and nothing else, Lau likes to fill it up. So what happens when we get to combat in widescreen? Well, he does the same thing, I think. He finds ingenious ways to make sure that all the areas of the screen are actually used creatively. So, for instance, the byplay with the cups becomes very important in this film, as you know. So that diagonal thrust of Mr. Fan's cup towards the Prince is picked up, is echoed, but reversed when the Prince thrusts the cup back. So you're really using the whole wide angle aspect. And here, the camera even tips up a little bit, rises a little bit to let the cups clash, a little different part of the frame. But then the fan comes into the frame to balance the shot in the far left there. Or here, where the cups are being brought in on a tray, and the servant then is holding it, and the camera lowers just a little bit so that you can see Mr. Fan's maneuver with his fan, and the Prince blocking it, perfectly aligned. It wouldn't be quite as visible if we kept the original framing, and then that's batted away too as the tray is withdrawn. So the frame is really being used. All the zones of the frame are being used. Or another example here, where the upper right becomes important, where the servant comes in with the tray and the finger is aimed at the Prince, and then we zoom back to rebalance the shot as the Prince deflects the blow and Mr. Fan continues to talk with him. Or here we have these close-ups of hands, and I'll be saying more about hands a little bit later, where the hands come in various configurations to fill up the frames. There's even something a little bit poking in on the far left that gets knocked down and deflected. So you have the movement, these kind of close-up action scenes, if you like, tabletop action scenes. Or here, one of my favorites is, again, the fake toast. It's actually a pressure point where Mr. Fan pushes the goblet towards the Prince, and then as the Prince deflects it, this time way off to the right, and the camera smoothly pans to the right to accommodate it. So this kind of constant refilling of the frame, all the zones of the screen are being used, is something I think that's very characteristic of Lau, and probably more characteristic of him than other filmmakers of the period. And of course, cups becomes important in this. You see the cup motif coming back again and again. It can be in the middle left, move to the center, move to the center a little bit favored to the right, then move to the left of center, and then go way off left, almost to the edge of the frame, but still within the shot, still within the frame. The camera's not moving at all, not panning to cover. This has all been mapped out like geometric coordinates. And I mentioned the cup and I mentioned the fan, and to go on with that, one of the things that allows for this close-up action scene, we might call it, is the use of those props. So Mr. Fan is identified with his fan at the beginning. He uses it as a kind of covert weapon from time to time, and later he'll use it to block the Prince's movement through the space. Later in a sequence I haven't shown you yet, because the sequence goes on past the clip I used, he tries to use the fan as a kind of shield against himself, but it fails because the Prince's kung fu is better and penetrates with a punch to the throat. Same thing here with cups. The cups are really part of the fight, and the clinking and the pressure of each one of them allow this close-up action scene that we're talking about. There's a beautiful example of the balancing and that kind of low angle that the Shaw brothers like. And I even love the fact that Lau has filled the frame to the point of that little head in the left-hand lower corner there. The woman just looking on very calmly like, oh, yeah, this happens all the time. Later, again, in the sequence I haven't shown you, the fight continues, and this time he gives us a beautiful high-angle shot, abstract geometric kind of shot of the clash of the cups, the fight of the cups. At the very end of the sequence, both the servant and Mr. Fan have collapsed, and to top it off, as they lie there, there's a little bit of a punctuation given by the cup falling over on the surface of the table. So that cup element comes back again and again to the film, to the sequence, as the fan does. So again, the idea of restricting your elements very narrowly, but using cinematic means, in this case the frame, as a way of dynamizing everything that's going on. So there really is a vast use of all the zones of the frame, top, bottom, side to side, center, off center. The whole thing, you really feel like these things just wouldn't function without the widescreen. So here's an example again. The servant's crane attack. You haven't seen this in the clip, but there again. And now you can even have the cup thrust out at the audience as if it were 3D or something like that. This really is a series of action scenes that are designed for the widescreen. They would not work in the normal, narrower format because he's really using that every inch of that area. Let me move to cutting now and make a quick note on Hong Kong martial arts cutting. It's sometimes said that Hong Kong filmmakers use long takes and full shots to show the entirety of combat moves, that they have a respect for the integral quality, the totality of the combat. It's true they do have that respect, but I think it's not necessarily the case that long takes, sustained shots, are as common as we might think. Actually, from the Shaw's period, this is a very editing-centered cinema. Combat scenes are very cut up from most directors of this period. The trick is that close views are brief, but so are the long shots. That is, there's a kind of a belief, particularly among Western directors, that if you're going to have a long shot, it should be held on the screen a very long time. If you're going to have close views, those can be cut more quickly. But what the Shaws discovered, I think, the Shaw brothers directors discovered, is that you can cut long shots just as quickly as you cut short ones if you compose them carefully. This is where it comes back to the idea of exactly how you dynamize the frame, how you fill that space. So Hong Kong directors quickly discovered that a carefully composed long shot could be quickly grasped, the audience could understand it right away, and it could be cut fast. Chang Cheh films from the 60s, for instance, have average shot lengths of 5 to 8 seconds. And if we go to Lau, whose career as director starts in the 70s, his films average 3 to 5 seconds per shot. Many of the films have over 1,000 shots. They're very quickly cut, even when many of them are showing us long shots. And we'll see this as we go along. So there are usually considered two ways to edit a scene. One is analytical editing, where you break the scene up into details. You give a master shot. You show the totality of the action. And then to emphasize some aspect of the action, you cut in. So the first shot is the long shot. The second shot is a closer view, in this case, the two fighters. And then in the course of that shot, that's a continuation, they battle and exchange positions, actually. So the Wang Yu character moves to the right. And then we get a reestablishing shot that shows them facing off against one another. So we have a kind of a parallel to the opening. The audience always knows where the people are, who's facing whom, and so forth. This is analytical editing, the analysis of the space. And then once you've presented an establishing shot or a reestablishing shot, you can then go in for another detail and continue analyzing the space further. So that's the premise, and the Shaw's films accept this premise. This is one of those things that the American cinema helped introduce in the early years of feature filmmaking. Well, we can see in Lau's work that he certainly mastered the analytical editing, but he does it often for particular details that aren't just the faces of the fighters, but actually information about their tactics, their fighting techniques. So take Challenge of the Masters, where he develops this technique of the powerful kick, the fatal kick. And he cuts in for a close-up of the kick, not of the faces of the fighters, but the kick. And then we get another shot of the fallen fighter, and then a shot of Lau himself, because he's playing the performer here. Classic analytical editing. And then he bends down and pulls off the steel tip that's on his shoe. So now we get, through analytical editing, we get the clue about how he was managed to have this savage kick. So here it's not just analyzing to show who was where and what their relationship is to one another, or even their reaction, as in the reaction shot of Lau, number 4, but actually an important story point about the technique of the combat. We see it in Dirty Ho, too, analytical editing in that confined space where we've seen the party parlor, and then we cut from the long shot to close-up of the wine being poured. Or we have a shot of the two men from one angle, and then a shot of a single, in this case of the prince, from another angle. And this is a match on action. So we see the actual action carried over from one shot to the next. These are classic techniques of analytical editing. I want to show you our next Lau Kar-leung extract from Executioners of Shaolin now. And you can watch and see how very adroit he is, very skillful he is in using analytical editing.
哎，洪习官来了，是那儿。洪习官来了。
In Executioners from Shaolin, we see the target space presented as the extreme long shot of the palace, and then a pan and zoom to show us the arrival of Hong himself as he comes, this long shot as a zoom shot. And then the establishing process is picked up again. We have the shot of the figures, the defenders, the guardians of the palace up there, turning away. And then there's a zoom shot pulling back to show his relationship to that palace, to that stair. In both of those setting up scenes, we have shots. We have a very strong sense of that staircase, and that's going to be the primary arena of action. What the storytelling function here is, we have to show that he's surrounded. Once he arrives, he comes up to the staircase, and the camera pans over again, establishing that there's a whole guard troop of soldiers there ready to take him on, and they surround him. So as he ascends the stair, we turn back and we see it. So we've had two sorts of establishings. On the one hand, the men at the top of the stair and the temple and our hero's relationship to it. The other at the bottom of the staircase where the men are surrounded. So he seems to be cut off. So the action is going to be quite confined to this staircase, the strip of activity. And indeed, to reaffirm this, Lau gives us a shot of him over his shoulder, seeing the men mounting their attack at the top of the staircase and racking focus to him, registering it. So now we understand everything. Through analytical editing, we understand that he's surrounded. And that's going to get reestablished again and again in the course of the film. So we'll get different shots showing him opposed by the men at the bottom of the stair, and then shots of the men on the stair, and a zoom back in this case, which gives us the first time a full establishing shot of the palace, the men at the bottom, the attackers on both sides, and of course hung in the middle. And we get closer views then of that. So classic analytical editing here. We break the scene up into the details, facing those men, facing the other men, and shots from both the top of the stair and the bottom of the stair. So we have kind of what's sometimes called camera ubiquity. The camera can go lots of different places. And this is characteristic of Lau. Lau has a tremendous freedom of camera placement. He has a wonderful sense, I think, of all the different varieties of angles he can get. You saw that in the Dirty Ho sequence. There's a progress up the steps as we go. We understand the next phase of the action is going to be him fighting his way up to the palace, and that's what we get. He's moving up the steps. He meets the combatants. He fights with them as he goes, and the camera goes in different places. It's from the side, showing him ascending the steps. It's from the top, looking down at him. It's from the bottom, looking up at him. And sometimes you get this variety of the robes around the guardians at the top, moving aside to reveal his progress. So the dynamic of the scene is him making his way up the staircase, and it's revealed shot by shot in a lot of different angles. And some of those angles are used for emphasizing the fight itself, the actual impact of the blows. So, for instance, here's an example where he hits someone, and then they lock. The staff is locked with the sword, and you get this beautiful shot. He cuts in a very short shot, actually, of Hung's face as a kind of collage with all these different angles of weapons angling towards each other: spears, his staff, and the men's arms and faces pasted into it. Very beautiful framing. One of the things that he liked to speak of, he said in an interview, you can get a wonderful sense of two pairs of hands folding and sliding in and out of each other's grip, intercut with the actor's facial expressions. And this is, I think, very characteristic of Lau, this attention to the grip, the use of hands in martial arts combat. This is a cut from the second shot I've shown you here, an insert of the hands all gripping one way or another. It's a very brief shot because he zooms back very fast as they break the lock, and Hung sends the one man sprawling through snapping his weapon. So that kind of powerful impact of the shots is given, again, all within that framework of analytical editing, of giving us details of something that's been established more broadly. Time is analyzed too, because part of analytical editing involves what's called matches on action. And we saw it with the prince stroking his mustache. Here we get it with man falling backwards after Hung's blow, and the action continues as he falls onto the steps. One of the flashiest examples, and this really shows Lau to be a particularly meticulous filmmaker, in my opinion, you have an extreme long shot of the fight taking place from the standpoint of the soldiers at the foot of the stair. And then you have a zoom in as Hung sends one of the men in the blue outfit, sprawling. You see him falling there. And then he cuts to that same action of the man tumbling down the steps in blue from another angle, from an extreme long shot, and he matches the action. The action flows perfectly. And he zooms back from that to give you another variation of the reestablishing shot. So one of the things this teaches us, of course, is that the zoom can be cooperating, can have some of the same functions as cutting. The zoom can be giving us something like analytical breakdown and reestablishment of the action, zooming in, zooming back. And that is like cutting in and cutting back. But the other thing I want to emphasize is how virtuosic it is to match that action of the falling man in two shots, two long, distant shots. Most directors would not try that. It's too difficult. I could say a lot more about this sequence. It's very flamboyant, but I'll just end with one of the things it manages to do is to get us up the steps and cross over to show the action from another angle. One of the things that's talked about in terms of analytical editing is if you want to break the axis of action that connects the characters, you can do it by having a straight-on shot on the line. Characters either moving straight to the camera or straight away from the camera. And that's what he does here, because mostly the action has been shown from the side sort of to the right in this frame. But now, after showing us the head-on shot of Hung coming up, he can cut to the left, the other side, the left of that first frame, and we're seeing coming from another side as he pushes the men aside and, in fact, meets, guess who, Kar-leung himself as he continues on his way up to the palace. There's a lot more to be said about this sequence, but I think you get the idea of how it's really based on a mastery of analytical editing, perfectly cut together to emphasize exactly what he wants at the moment he needs to do it. The average shot here is only 4 seconds. On so many long shots we have, but still, it's all very quickly cut. Now, one of the things I think he does like is to challenge himself. Lau likes to set himself problems, and that includes working in very confined spaces. So we have the zigzag alley in Marshall Club, where there's an alley that gets narrower and narrower as you go along, until finally you see them fighting in this narrow, itsy-bitsy space. And in fact, Lau Kar-fai's arm gets thrust into a brick wall, which pushed right into the wall. You see it in that lower chunk there. And then Lau gives us a shot from inside the wall where the broken bricks frame the action that we see. This is really flagrant. I mean, this is really taking advantage of he's having fun here. The camera can be anywhere. This is camera ubiquity. And it's as if he decided, okay, another alley, confined space, let's try it with 3 people. And he does that in Legendary Weapons of China. The men and the woman, and they hide by shinnying up the alleyway. It's narrow enough for them to just stretch themselves and hold themselves above. Again, Lau Kar-fai as he comes through, and another beautifully composed shot that fills the whole frame with the fan on one side, the darts and the sword and the dagger on the other. Beautifully done. And again, just setting himself another problem. How do you use analytical editing in such a confined and narrow space? Now, he doesn't always use analytical editing. He will have the option of the other type of technique of editing known as constructive editing. That allows us to create impossible martial feats, impossible quotes in quotes. And we find that again in the Shaw Brothers films from the 60s on. If you want to have swordsmen who can really leap, you can start by showing a shot of one confronting his adversary and jumping out of the frame. Cut to the other fighter looking up. Cut to a shot launched by trampoline of Wang Yu coming down and descending behind his adversary. And then another shot of him landing and the adversary stricken and then falling as he stands up. Beautifully done and handled by cutting the action up into bits that can be filmed separately. Instead of showing a single long shot, as we might today using CGI, Wonder Woman jumps up and she jumps 3 stories and lands on the top of the building or something like that, all in one long shot. That's not as feasible in the 1960s. So what you do is instead break it up into bits that can be shot separately and cut together. That's constructive editing. The whole action isn't shown in a single establishing shot. And we'll see that in our next Kar-leung extract, The Legendary Weapons of China.
客官，这间房的客人刚刚走，房间还没收拾呢。
这间房的客人还会不会回来？
不知道。
不知道。
好，那我就住这间房好了。
好。
上面是什么地方？
上面是阁楼。
阁楼？干什么用的？
摆零碎东西的。哎，什么事啊，客官？
上面有人。
不会啊，上面都是些杂物，不会有人啊。
怎么会有声音呢？
哦，一定是猫捉老鼠啊！
猫捉老鼠。
喵，喵。那客官对不对？我说是猫捉老鼠嘛。
So we know he likes to experiment with editing in confined spaces. And that's what we find in the loft and bedroom scene in Legendary Weapons, where the two intruders look at one another. First of all, they're not in the same shot. We build that space, right, inferring they're looking at one another. So we don't have an establishing shot. But then we get one, a kind of weird establishing shot of showing the woman looking down and the man looking down at her. So you got you have the man looking down and the woman looking down on different floors. The camera moves down from him above to her below. And we thereby understand that the two of them are stacked. And she learns of his presence when his little fish line goes down to go with her grappling hook to try to snag the pillow. And as the scene goes on, we understand one is above and one is below. We don't really have any more establishing shots for quite some time, but we understand through the tug of war, through the thread and other means, that who's who and who's where, and the gags, including the vapor that comes down through the little reed, and the smoke that comes out his ears at the same time. So this is all, and what I want to emphasize here is this can all be filmed separately. You can film all the shots of one character at one time, all the shots of the other, but you have to keep very clear and very precise about what you're showing, because these are going to have to be consistent from shot to shot. The angle of the action that you're filming, the way that people are looking at one another, the positioning, and all that has to be very much in your head, if not drawn out on paper, to make sure that it makes sense to the audience. You can imagine if the characters were shown from different angles than these, it might be more difficult for us to fully understand what's going on. Now, there are moments when they're both in the same shot together, or parts of them are in the same shot together. They look at one another. And they're over their shoulders. You can see a little bit of each one in some of these shots. So they're kind of in contiguity. So we've had some sort of softcore analytical editing at this point. We see some of them doing what they do, little bits and pieces of them. But now we have full-blown constructive editing. When Titan comes in, again, Gordon Liu, Lau Kar-fai, comes in, and now all the action is going to be based between cutting between one space and another, and the actors will not be seen all in the same space. All three of them will not be shown in the same establishing shot. He comes in, together they look down, so we understand they're in proximity, and he tests his comforter there with his spear, and we get to occasional shots of them upstairs in the same frame. So we understand they're together, even though we'll have a lot of shots of them separate. When they have their little fight, here's another example of a shot of them together. One bends down to listen. The other bends down in the foreground to listen. So we do have some establishing shots of them upstairs, but we never have an establishing shot that shows all of them in the same frame. And the pattern then gets to be developed. We see him suspicious about what's going on above him, and we see them upstairs fighting with one another. And that's often done through separate shots of them. Same pattern. He gets suspicious with his spear. You know, the cat fake out. Again, shot, reverse shot. We understand through the eye lines and the positions that they're opposite one another. And we've already seen them occasionally in the same frame. So it's kind of analytical, but it's constructive in respect to him, because he's always, and even when he's probing, he sends his spear up, but you don't see him. So it'd be very easy as a filmmaker for you to shoot these scenes of the spear coming into the loft up above. The culmination of the scene, of course, is to continue this pattern of him down below, them upstairs, interacting with one another. So the thief upstairs flashes his ninja star, and she flies out the window. He hears that down below, probes with his spear, and the thief has to dodge the spear, but we don't have him, that is to say Titan, in the same frame. And then a shot of him staring at the cat that drops after the gas is released, the ninja trick. And even there, he and the cat are not in the same frame. So it would have been very easy to film this by having the cat drop in when Lau Kar-fai was off having coffee or something somewhere. And we end on him reacting. So the second part of the scene is really based on constructive editing. Even though the first part has a dose of it, it's more extreme in the case of the latter part of the scene. In this scene of 262 seconds, there are 126 shots, which makes the average shot just about 2 seconds, which is incredibly fast cut, considering how much information is packed into every one of these frames. My last technique I want to discuss is the so-called smash zoom, and that's become associated with Hong Kong cinema throughout. Either you show someone about to attack someone and have them pointed towards the camera more or less and zoom back as they launch their attack, and the impact of the zoom is almost like a punch coming to the audience. Or the opposite goes when someone is stricken, you show them stricken and you zoom in on their reaction. You like plunged and brought up face to face with them, yanked into the frame. Well, these are commonplaces, and they're certainly part of the Shaw Brothers style. It was common in 60s cinema generally because a lot of directors began to explore the stylistics of the zoom. For instance, Richard Lester in Help could make a gag of the smash zoom. You've got George Harrison apparently skiing, but then we zoom back and show that he isn't on skis at all. He's just hopping down the mountain, pretending to ski. And you have something more gentle, we might say, with Bullet, where our hero's car takes off. And as it takes off, we zoom to follow him under that underpass, and we follow him as he drives, tailing somebody. But then it zooms back to show that actually he's being tailed too. Another car comes into the foreground. So the zoom is not as aggressive in those cases. It's kind of probing or poking around in the space of the scene. But it's still that enlargement or de-enlargement of the frame. A gentle zoom became part of European art cinema, too, at the time. Someone like Jancho, who had combined camera movements, figure movements, and zooming with very powerful effects. So here, the officer interrogates the witness, sends him off, then walks over to the old man. The old man he follows, and then the witness and the old man stand as the officer slaps around a woman behind that wall there in the background. And we zoom in even more to show their faces. These are not cuts. This is all one long take of the camera with camera movement and zooming, substituting for the analytical editing we might have otherwise. And it allows for characters to move back and forth through the space in a kind of choreographic way. Well, I think people gave Jancho a lot of credit for this. This is a pretty creative way to make a film, but they didn't give Hong Kong directors credit for something I think is equally creative, their use of the smash zoom for action scenes. Certainly one thing it can do is emphasize the impact and rhythm of combat. Take the Blood Brothers, another one choreographed by our man Lau. So we have a shot of Leung, zoom back in a typical way, that impact zoom, the punch, as he fights David Chang. He ducks down, David Chang leaps up, and then we zoom still further back to another phase of the fight. So the zoom is kind of punctuating or breaking up the fight into different stages. And now we can see that Chang goes off to the right. So we've had two zooms here, zoom back a bit and then zoom back a lot. And that sort of gives you a sense of the different phases of the fight. It can also give a sense of pauses or stopping points. Again, I'll take the Blood Brothers, Leung, and this is continuous in what we just saw. We zoom back. There's no movement. They're just facing each other. Reverse angle cut, Chang, zoom back, reverse angle. So the perfectly symmetrical. And the zoom is really just stressing the moment of stasis, the pause, rather than the burst. But then the burst comes. We go from Leung fighting, and then the weapons go to the ground, and we zoom in on that particular maneuver of the sword pinning the staff to the floor, the ground. And then we cut to Leung, and then rising again as he clambers up to fight again. So the zoom can function to pause, or to emphasize a pause, but it can also mark off stages of the combat. Well, you'll see this in the next excerpt I'll show you from Return to the 36th Chamber, where we get portions of the wrist tying action, where one of the strategies is discovered in the course of this fight scene. The man who attacks our man, Chen, he grasps the robe and pulls at the robe. And then we have a cut, it's a classic analytical cut, it's not a zoom, to his fingers tearing the robe. But then immediately that piece of fabric becomes a kind of template or marker for what's going to happen in the rest of the scene, because that piece of fabric will be used by Lau Kar-fai to tie the man's wrists. And he's able to do this because he's mastered the technique of building bamboo scaffolding and tying it with bamboo cords. So he creates a kind of handcuff for this guy. And Lau is careful to cut to the shot and show us exactly how those hands interact. And again, you might think of that idea of two hands folding and sliding in and out of each other's grasp. He's very interested in those hands. And then we zoom back to see what he's done. So here the technique is used to emphasize the very specific tactic, the combat tactic that's going to become important in the sequence to come as a kind of template for all the variations he's going to work on that. The sequence that you're going to see is, again, got a very rapid cutting rate, about 2.7 seconds average. But the interesting thing is that those cuts are integrated with zooms. So again and again, you'll see that there's a zoom and a cut, or a cut and a zoom, again and again, right next to each other. So about half the shots have zooms in them. And this is our last extract, a continuation of what I just showed you from Return to the 36th Chamber.
你们见识太少，先露一点给你们看看。从今天开始，把你们以前扣工人的钱，通通还给他们。饭桶！马总管，现在你看见我的功夫是真的了吧？如果你想息事宁人的话，就快点把扣的工钱全部还给他们。做吧！ 黄高峰老板。
哼，你就是上次扮三德和尚的那个人。
是。不过我现在是真真正正从少林寺出来的周仁杰。
哦，怪不得你有这么好的身手。
我今天来，不是跟你们算账，是想黄老板调整一下这3年来所扣工人的工钱。
哦，看来我今天真是要试一试少林寺的功夫。
我已经准备好让你试试。
You saw in that sequence several of the things we've already talked about. The zoom that magnifies reactions. We can see him when he comes in and zoom in to get his reaction. We can see him after he's cast off his robe to pull back. So in both cases, we're really stressing a key moment in the drama, his recognition of the Manchus in the first case, and now his willingness to fight. And we can see those cords, those bamboo cords he positions at his waist in order to use them as his tools. And to suggest a difference from what we saw in that extract, I'd like to recall a scene from Crippled Avengers, a Chang Cheh film, not choreographed by Lau Kar-leung, where he uses the zoom in a more, well, in a way that doesn't emphasize the particular tactics as closely. So, for instance, one of the Venoms throws a ring, this is part of the gags of this film, a ring to the adversary. The other fighter misses a cut, bashes it aside, and zooms back. So now we have our master shot. The gesture, the movement has motivated the cut back, the zoom back, so we have the two fighting. In the course of the scene, they fight with one another in various ways, using the ring as a kind of placeholder for a sword. But there are many cases where their hands grasp each other or clash with each other at various points. But never does Chang Cheh zoom in on those hands. He's not interested in them. He's interested in the overall athletic or acrobatic qualities of their fight. He's interested in the bodies as a whole. So even as a moment when the ring is pushed out of the frame, and Lau would, I think, not do this. I don't think he would have the frame cut off the weapon in that way. As we saw, he likes to put everything very tidily in a composition of the frame. And there is some wasted space on the left-hand side, too. So there's a way in which I think the emphasis is much more on the clash of the two men than it is on the particular tactic of hand-to-hand qualities. So at the end, when they face one another, at the end of the shot, when they face one another, we can cut in, and he cuts straight into the face of the combatant, and they start all over again. That's the beginning of another zoom. So he's more interested in the facial reactions of the characters and their bodily positions and their gestures than he is in in the hands and the way the hands grip and become part of a basic tactic. Well, that's different, I think, with Return to the 36th Chamber, where Lau really does make the whole action revolve around handwork. That's given to us in the beginning when we see one of the miscreants lashed to a pole and how severe that lashing can be because it causes blood. So hands are marked out even when there isn't a big close-up of them. But then in the course of the action, we get a big close-ups of them as we see in detail the tying technique that the Lau Kar-fai character has mastered in his work on the scaffolding. This is scaffolding kung fu, after all. And we have to sort of figure out what his tactic is. I mean, why is he tying these things up the way he is? But there's lots of details. And again, zooming back from the tying gesture to a larger picture of what he's doing. So we always get the anchoring of showing the entire space, but at the same time, the specifics of what the combat strategy is. And then he starts to play some variations. So first we have him almost getting the inspiration for his tactic by having one attacker use a pole on him. Comes at him with a pole, and then he gets a pole and uses it in close up again, zooming back against the other, waxes the back of his knee to bring him down. So there's our zoom that emphasizes the pole as a tactic. And then we get an angle that shows him tying up our man, and we see the first act. So the first phase of this is, in a way, here's how to use the pole and the technique of scaffolding, tying the bamboo cords to combat. And it's even made a point of a comic twist at the end by having Lau Kar-fai's ally whack the pole a couple times with the man in it. But that's the first variation. The second variation, I think, involves an ensemble, not just a single attacker. Several men come at him, again with poles. And again, we see him use the poles. But now he uses them as leverage to spin people around in a kind of horizontal configuration, like a merry-go-round almost. And at various points, through zooms and cuts, we see him create these combinations. It's kind of an engineering project here of lining these guys up, lashing the poles together, the purpose being revealed by both close views and the longer views. And finally, you begin to realize he's creating a kind of hitching post or railing that's going to tie them to it. And finally, we get the payoff when we see that lineup of men in the horizontal row, what he's done with creating those poles that way. And in fact, it's underscored by the fact when the Manchu landlord looks down and we get a close-up of the hands wiggling in the foreground. That's a classic Lau shot, it seems to me. So first ensemble, horizontal layout of the men. What can you do next with poles and bamboo cord? Well, let's try another strategy. Now, Lau Kar-fai grabs the poles and runs with several of them. What's he doing with these poles? And he then starts to mount them in various ways. He beats off his attackers and then starts to pivot the poles upward to create a kind of bouquet of poles and invites each man to attack him only to pin him within this expanding sort of hairpin of poles. And again, the hands come through. It's all about the hands. He gets three of them together, and then a fourth one comes, his main adversary comes and whacks his pole right down the middle of this little rosette he's creating of people pinned down. And again, you get a shot, low angle, this time not of just one pair of hands wiggling, but several, which echoes the one we saw before. I mean, this is very intricate filmmaking, it seems to me. This is very careful and pictorially adventurous filmmaking. Of the theme and variations with poles and cords and the dance-like dynamic of filling the frame and showing people in different positions that all turn out to be perfectly composed. Every time, almost any time you stop on a frame, you get a perfect composition. Well, those accomplishments I've tried to lay out for you are only a few of many, many ones. And you could say a lot more about the various films that Lau made in this period, but I think it's time to stop. So I just want to end with mentioning that by the mid-1980s, the Shaw Studios ease out of theatrical film production. They shift their resources to broadcast television. And Lau moves to one-off projects. Some films quite important and interesting, I think, like Tiger on Beat. But the Shaw's style as a studio style sort of comes to an end, I think. But that doesn't prevent us from saying that with Lau, we have a major filmmaker of the 70s and 80s who built and refined a vibrant local tradition, one that you can be proud of, I think, and has had enduring influence. So the comic Kung Fu of Jackie Chan, for instance, as is well known, is sort of initiated by what Lau was up to. Or the precisionist approach I've tried to talk about, where filling every part of the frame and finding dynamic compositions to do that is picked up, I think, by someone like Yun Kuei. And of course, I have to mention that the work of Lau certainly played a role in inspiring Quentin Tarantino in Kill Bill, with Lau Kar-fai playing two roles.